George. The book really is focused, I would say, on the fact that the State of Israel has unlocked the genius of the Jewish people. Now, that was a long road, though. It didn't happen overnight. And perhaps you can explain how it happened and the connection with Jewish genius throughout the centuries and why it has been allowed to flower now and what the fruits of that flowering have been.
Well, I think it's fascinating that Jewish genius was not manifested economically and technologically to a great extent until the 20th century. Chaim Weizmann gave a speech in 1909 in London, raising money for Technion. He wanted to establish a MIT equivalent in Israel. And in his speech, he declared that his greatest obstacle was the absence of Jewish scientists who were competent to man this faculty. And he had to find some Jewish scientists. And this meant that he said that the only Jews who'd had an important impact on the world's intellectual life were Marx and Spinoza. And he was apparently oblivious to Einstein's Annus Mirabilis in 1905, as most of the world was. I mean, these were papers in various obscure sciences that had yet to manifest themselves. But when it did, the chief effect was to shift economic activity from a focus on material manipulation, movements of heavy resources and industrial goods, into a more abstract and intellectual domain. And it seems to me that the rise of Israel has paralleled this science that Einstein, in fact, broached to a great extent in 1905 and, of course, in subsequent years, and that finally reached its efflorescence in quantum theory that was greatly Jewish achievement. Bohr was mostly Jewish, and von Neumann was a great figure in translating quantum theory into mathematics, and Pauli was a crucial contributor, and there were lots of other scientists, but the real core of quantum theory, you can say, is a contribution of Jews, and I believe that Israel really concentrates the genius of the Jews, and as you put it, unlocked the genius of the Jews in a national environment, permitting the enrichment of the entire world, but most deeply the United States. And I guess I can say that my discovery of this fact came from my writing about Intel Corporation. Intel is the most important American corporation, in my judgment. It launched the microchip industry, which laid the foundations for the efflorescence of information technology, the emergence of the Internet. Intel was the key company, and this translated into America's both post-war prosperity and its military prowess. And it was a contribution chiefly by Israel. I mean, when I wrote Microcosm, I did not understand that all the key inventions of Intel after its first few years came from Israelis. And the invention that produced 80% of its profits at the beginning came from an Israeli, Dov Froman. Dov Froman later established the Design Center in Haifa, which later produced the 8088 microprocessor, which was the foundation of the IBM personal computer, the 8087 microprocessor that allowed personal computers to become enterprise machines. The 386, 75% of all the 386s were actually manufactured in Israel during one period. And then the Pentium, and finally the Core i7, which was advertised in the Super Bowl this year as the most important chip Intel ever made. This was something of a hype. But its name is Nahalem, which means streams, and it conveys the multi-core capabilities of this, multi-thread capabilities of the Core i7. And the Centrino, which connects us all to the internet, was designed in Israel. And the Dov Froman's contribution was non-volatile memory, which evolved into the flash memory. And Israelis, many of whom were students of Dov Froman, forged the global flash memory industry. Eli Harari, Dov Moran, Boaz Aitan, Rafi Klein, all these people were critical in the development of non-volatile memory, and it's SanDisk and M-Systems, all these companies that made possible the iPod, the Nano, and all these other devices, but also made possible Predators and drones and anti-missiles and F-16 electronics. I could go on and on, but the fact is, it's not hard to demonstrate that American prosperity today and military capabilities have been heavily dependent on Israel, as heavily dependent as the entire West was during the Second World War, when a bunch of Jewish scientists from Europe manned the Manhattan Project that created the first atomic bomb and allowed the West to prevail. So I believe that that point about cursing nations that curse the Jews and blessing nations that bless the Jews is, it's a religious assertion, but it has direct empirical correlatives in the world, and that's what my book is about to a great extent. Sorry to be so long.
No. I think it was a very good introduction to the Israel test. The corollaries of the question is that while the Jewish people are associated with progress and the development of Western civilization, there is a countervailing force, which you identify as having been encapsulated by Nazism. But you also state in the book that Nazism didn't die with the death of Adolf Hitler and the end of the Third Reich, that it has continued on. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit about that and how you see the forces rubbing against one another and confronting one another.
Well, Nazism was a great enthusiasm of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Al-Husseini, who came to Germany and conferred with Adolf Hitler, visited Auschwitz with Himmler and Eichmann, and was enthusiastic advocate of the final solution and urgently demanded its application in the Middle East. Now, this is the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who is the effective founder of the PLO and inspiration to his possibly distant cousin, Yasser Arafat. And Arafat, too, was a great enthusiast for the book Mein Kampf. And this is essentially when part of the story of my book is the delivery of the Palestinian people by the international community into the hands of a Nazi movement. And that's really the story. The Palestinians have been the greatest beneficiaries of Israel. Between 1967, when Israel took over the territories, and around 1990, when the first Intifada erupted, and perhaps 250,000 Israeli settlers moved into the West Bank and Gaza. And they transformed these regions. There was kind of the wild east of Israel, and the tax rates and regulations were less rigorously imposed there, and so the West Bank and Gaza became two of the fastest growing economies in the face of the earth. But the movement of these 250,000 Israeli settlers didn't displace anyone. During those years, the number of Palestinians tripled from around 1 million to around 3 million in the territories. And this wasn't a matter of exploiting the Palestinians. Indeed, the Palestinian per capita income tripled during this period in the West Bank and rose 20-fold in Gaza. So it was a tremendous economic triumph the Palestinians forged in collaboration with the Israelis. And what brought it to an end was this incredible success caused the PLO and Arafat back in Tunisia to panic. And this was getting out of control. The PLO was no longer needed. And so Arafat turned to the United Nations and to the peace process. You know, the Oslo Syndrome is a good book that explains this process. And the international community brought in Arafat, gave him billions of dollars of foreign aid, and delivered the poor Palestinians to his leadership. And that's the tragedy that occurred, and thus delivered Palestine to a recrudescence of the Nazi movement that convulsed Israel, convulsed Europe 30 years before.
In my interview with you back in October, we talked a little bit about Aaron Klein's book, The Late Great State of Israel. I don't know if many people have read that book here, but Aaron Klein wrote a book. It's not he's a patriot. He's a journalist who works in Israel, but he feels that the Israeli government itself has often failed the Israel test. And you actually state that in your book. And I'd like you to comment a little bit about that and how it emerged from I'd say is the stranglehold of socialism to really flower in the 1990s and 2000s.
Well, it started in the mid-1980s with just runaway inflation and high unemployment and economic catastrophe in Israel. I mean, inflation spiked to 1,000% in 1 year, and a unity government was elected. Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir took office and actually initiated a program of tax rate reductions and deregulation that made possible a revival of the Israeli economy. By 1990, there began a real transformation of Israel through the arrival of 1 million Russians over about a 5-year period. This was like the whole population of France moving to the United States. I mean, it was just a huge infusion into Israel, and it was described as a catastrophe at the time. People were terrified by this invasion from Russia, but it turned out that these were many of the most sophisticated engineers and scientists and entrepreneurs of Russia arrived in Israel, and at the same time a lot of Americans began making their aliyah, venture capitalists and business executives, and together they transformed the Israeli economy and its politics. Nathan Sharansky led these Russians, and the Russians together did open new opportunities for conservatism in Israel, and the balance of power in Israeli politics changed drastically. You couldn't have socialism anymore after these virulent anti-communist Russians came to have a key role in the population. And then another key figure is Netanyahu. And Netanyahu represents a tradition that combines both American and Israeli themes. In my book, I describe him as the most American of Israeli leaders and the most deeply Israeli. His father, Ben-Zion, was kind of amanuensis for Zev Jabotinsky, who wrote about the spirit of enterprise and entrepreneurial growth and greater Israel, and was really a great voice of kind of supply side conservatism, and Netanyahu was a close ally of his, and Benjamin learned from it. And then Netanyahu went to the United States and studied because Ben-Zion couldn't get a job in Israel. He was maybe he was too conservative, we don't know, but anyway, he was kind of a bristling fella and Jabotinsky exponent, and he couldn't get a job in the universities in Israel. So Ben-Zion Netanyahu came to the United States, and then first to a obscure college in Pennsylvania, and then to Cornell, where he wrote this great masterpiece on anti-Semitism in Europe, showing incidentally that it was not driven by Christianity. And it's quite a powerful book with wonderful insights. Really showed that the resistance to Jews in the Spanish Inquisition was not to their Judaism, but to their excessively resourceful and effective espousal of Christianity. And they were the most effective Christians, and they were displacing the old established incumbents, and the king paid more attention to them than to the previous leaders. And so it was a case of envy and resentment of excellence rather than normal anti-Semitism, at least religious anti-Semitism that was manifested in the Spanish Inquisition. That was Ben-Zion's great book. In any case, Netanyahu went from MIT to the Boston Consulting Group. At the very time that the Boston Consulting Group was developing the learning curve and the experience curve and the growth share matrix, all these business concepts that are the foundation of what we call supply-side economics. All these studies focused on entrepreneurial creativity. They focused on lowering costs to increase business revenues. You lower prices rather than increase prices. And Netanyahu was really one of the first supply-siders in translating this business concept into a governmental concept. Cutting tax rates yields more revenues than raising tax rates. So not only we all know Netanyahu is the leading expert on terrorism for the last 30 years, ever since his brother was killed at Entebbe, but he's also a great economic leader, and he reached his pinnacle under the Sharon government when he negotiated with Snow and Bush, the Bush administration, the Secretary of Treasury Snow, this radical restructuring of the Israeli economy, and that reduced public ownership of corporations, of the leading corporations in Israel, from 60 to 80% down to 20%, and cut tax rates further, emancipated hedge funds and financial innovation, and just a radical restructuring of the Israeli economy that he was capable of accomplishing through the instrument of Bush's support for guaranteeing Israeli bonds. Snow demanded that the Israelis pass this program of reforms that Netanyahu wanted, but the supposed source of the proposal was the U.S., and the U.S. was demanding it in exchange for guaranteeing the Israeli bonds, which was critical at this point. The Second Intifada had inflicted real fear in investors in Israel. So this was, Netanyahu has been pivotal over and over again in the ascent of the Israeli economy. That wasn't your question, was it?
No. It's fine. It's fine. We spend a lot of time here at the American Freedom Alliance examining multiculturalism and its impact on the West and on identity in general. We've seen the debilitating effect that it's had on Europe and its own sense of identity. Israel suffers from much the same affliction in certain respects. You talked about the Oslo syndrome, identifying with its enemies, adopting the victimology identity that is foisted upon by its enemies. I'd like to know, how crucial do you think the Jewishness of the Jewish state is to its survival?
Well, I certainly think that what Israel is the Jewish state. I mean, that's its identity, and so it's obviously crucial to its survival, and almost a tautology. I mean, it's if it's not a Jewish state, it no longer has any special attraction to the aliyah of other Jews, and it no longer concentrates the genius of Jews in the same way, no longer provides the outreach to other groups that Israel supplies. I mean, it's Jewish.
Let me clarify, because what I'm really talking about is post-Zionism, is the post-Zionist urge, particularly amongst secular Jews, to denude Israel of its Jewish identity, to strip it of its Jewish identity, and really become a nation like any other nations. And the movement towards a binational state of Jews and Arabs, which would embrace the Palestinians in the West Bank, poses, in my mind, a very serious threat to Israel's survival. And that's really the crux of my question.
Well, I agree. I mean, I don't. I mean, as I've said, I don't think that under current circumstances, where the Palestinians are led by terrorist thugs. They really, with some cosmetics, and Fayyad is more civilized than most of the others, but the essence of the movement is Nazism. It's devoted to the destruction of Israel. So I don't believe that capitulation by the Jews in Israel would lead to some wonderful collaborative joint state so I think it would result in the destruction of Israel. I mean, the momentum would be very negative. I do believe that the success of Israel in coming decades, I think it's just at the beginning of its ascent as one of the most creative and powerful and virtuous nations on the face of the earth. And the power of that example is likely ultimately to transform the Middle East. It's lead on all its neighbors in both entrepreneurial capability and technological invention and financial dynamism and military capability is increasing all the time. So I think eventually all kinds of transformations are going to happen. But to talk today about possibly transforming Israel from a Jewish state is just treachery. The very idea is going to just greatly enhance the virulence of the opponents of Israel. It encourages them. It's just appeasement does not result in peace. Appeasement produces war, as the great Israeli game theorist Robert Aumann, who won the Nobel Prize as a follower of John von Neumann, is shown. I have a chapter on him, and he's a major figure in showing that dynamic. And it's just a perverse and stupid argument to make at this point in history, when Israel is threatened by virulent neighbors on all sides, to start talking about maybe transforming Israel into some kind of eunuch for the neighboring Arab nations' delectation is a mistake.
Let's now turn to United States policy towards Israel. We've passed in the last 14 months from probably the most favorable U.S. administration towards Israel to probably one of the most hostile, if not the most hostile administration towards Israel. What impact does United States policy foreign policy have on the state of Israel? What do you see in the future in the two nations as it engages in this war on terror and in the continuing battle against what you call Nazi ideology?
Well, I believe that the Bush administration was very militantly pro-Israel. However, Israel fell to a less pro-Israel administration and to Pete Livni, and thus Bush was put in the predicament of having an appeasement-oriented Israeli government. And Olmert and Livni both were capitulating to the pressures against them faster than Bush could resist. And so it gave a tremendous opportunity for Condoleezza Rice, who may have been disposed against Israel to begin with, to take control of that policy. And that was a real misfortune, because it meant that this downward slide of America's engagement with Israel began at the end of the Bush administration, and then was accelerated and intensified by Obama. But as Caroline Glick always writes, Israel ultimately has to rely on its own capabilities and prowess. And I believe that, to me, Netanyahu is the leader of the West, and he has to continue that role. And it's a big challenge, and I believe he can rise to it. I think he's the greatest Western leader since Churchill or Reagan. I mean, he's a genuinely major titan in our world affairs, and I think he can maneuver these difficult times, maneuver Israel through these difficult times, and I believe that a new administration, a Republican administration that may well take office soon, will be very pro-Israel. I mean, we've had a demonstration of the fecklessness of an anti-Israel administration, and I believe that the conservatives are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And the people are more pro-Israel than the leadership and the experts, and so you get someone like Sarah Palin, who people may not like, but she is militantly pro-Israel, and that position enhances her influence and her appeal. It's not a flaw. It's actually an asset in her campaigning for office. So, and I think that most of the Republican leaders understand that this is a vulnerability of Obama and are going to move forward to rectify it.